This is our time. We can live like legends if we create it. We are in the blank slate, which means we have to get creative. Right, let's get into some news. A load of exposés to follow. Not as much COVID BS this week, and a bit of a gem near the end. Kabul, Afghanistan, and United States troops and their NATO allies, well, I never, intended to be out of Afghanistan by early to mid-July, well ahead of the President Biden's September the 11th withdrawal deadline, according to military officials, in what has turned into an accelerated ending to America's longest war. Nice ritual sacrifice date selected there, I see. And it was a sacrifice day long before 2001 also. Now, the Pentagon is still not determined how it will combat terrorist threats like Al-Qaeda, go and knock on Virginia's door, from afar after American troops leave. Nor have top Defense Department officials secured agreements from allies about repositioning American troops in other nearby countries. Administration officials are still grappling with the thorny question of American warplanes, most likely armed Reaper drones, will provide air support to Afghan forces to help prevent the country's cities from falling to the Taliban. But there's a simple solution to stop the Taliban reclaiming cities beginning at home. The solution is to rein in the CIA, and the Taliban issue goes away. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has authorized US embassies around the world to fly Black Lives Matter flags and banners, according to an internal cable reviewed by Foreign Policy as part of the administration's response to the one-year anniversary of the police murder of George Floyd that sparked international outrage and a nationwide reckoning on systemic racism. So why is this happening? I'm not for 1 minute playing down the violence of the police. I've experienced it myself back in the UK. But this is another agenda altogether. So why did Blinken do that? Because Blinken is born too. And Israel Cohen said we would use the blacks to bring down the whites in favour of the Jewish elites. Did he not? That's why it's playing out. The former Pentagon official who went public about reports of UFOs has filed a complaint with the agency's Inspector General, claiming a coordinated campaign to discredit him for speaking out, including accusing a top official of threatening to tell people he was crazy, according to documents that were reviewed by Politico. Now, Lou Elizondo, a career counterintelligence specialist who was assigned in 2008 to work for a Pentagon program that investigated reports of unmanned aerial phenomena. Unmanned. And filed the 64-page complaint to the independent watchdog on May the 3rd and has met several times with investigators, according to his legal team. Now, the claim that the government is trying to discredit him comes weeks before the Director of National Intelligence and the Pentagon are expected to deliver an unclassified report to Congress about UFOs and a government strategy for investigating such encounters. If you think the Pentagon is pursuing ET disclosure, you are not as awake as you think you are. Sorry, just not. And the common sense question is, why would you believe the Pentagon for disclosure above anybody else? Because if you do, the next question is, are you a Milgram experiment? And it's all pure distraction. The FBI is investigating what it describes as a massive scheme to illegally finance Senator Susan Collins' 2020 re-election bid, according to Axios. And a recently unsealed search warrant application shows the FBI believes an Hawaii defense contractor, Hawaii Defense, private contractors, illegally funneled $150,000 to a pro-Collins super PAC, PAC, and reimbursed donations to Collins' campaign. Now, according to the report, they always say this, there is no indication that Collins or her team were aware of any of it. Yeah. Now, Collins helped a contractor at issue, then called Navitec, and since renamed the Martin Defense Group, secure an $8 million Navy contract before most of the donations took place. So in other words, it's a kickback. And the former Navitec CEO Martin Cow was indicted last year for allegedly bilking the federal government of millions of dollars in coronavirus relief loans. So what are they saying? Well, the Collins for Senator campaign has absolutely no knowledge of anything alleged in the warrant, according to the Collins spokesperson Annie Clark. But what is the bigger picture? Well, federal prosecutors say Cow, K-A-O, used a shell company to funnel $150,000 in Navitec funds to a pro-Collins super PAC called 1820 PAC. And according to the FBI, Cow and his wife set up a sham LLC called the Society for Young Women Scientists and Engineers. And Navitec then wrote the LLC a $150,000 check, investigators say, which was passed on to the super PAC of Collins. Now, government contractors are barred from donating to federal political committees, and investigators suspect the donations were attempts to evade that prohibition. And investigators say bank records also show that Cow illegally reimbursed family members who donated to Collins' campaign, and that Navitec reimbursed some of Cow's colleagues for their contributions in what is known as a straw donation, but like straw man, really, and it is prohibited by law. Now, the Collins campaign fundraising solicitations also require donors to certify that they are in fact donating their own funds, and the alleged reimbursed donations came in clusters according to federal contribution records between June and September 2019, but it amounted to less than 0.2% of the Collins campaign total fundraising. $150,000 is only 0.2% of the fundraising. What a waste of money that is. People will be better, instead of donating to bogus and largely non-benevolent politicians, to the TPC, where we can actually use that money for better purposes than rogue politicians. Now, the warrant application quotes an email exchange between Cow, who had just maxed out to Collins' campaign, and the senator's main finance director. But the Collins staffer wrote, if you have friends or family members that would be willing to donate, please don't hesitate to send them my way. So they clearly were aware. And it's more evidence every single politician is bought and paid for many times over. You know, there's always some say, well, this one's not like this and this one. No, once you get in that system, you are bought and paid. It's that simple. That's why we have to create new politicians operating under the TPC guidelines. We can't trust their system. It doesn't work. But what this short piece didn't reveal was the involvement of the bigger defence contractors in this scam also. Now imagine if we collected all the kickbacks associated with politics in this country. We could likely run and fund several of the smaller countries' budgets on those payments alone. It's a national scandal. And here is another example of it. The masked man, Biden, has awarded an $86 million contract for hotel rooms near the border to hold around 1,200 migrant family members who cross the US-Mexico border, according to DHS officials. So why does this matter? Well, it's a sign of growing numbers of migrant families trying to come to the US, in addition to already overwhelming numbers of children crossing the border without their parents or legal guardians. And both trends appear to be straining government resources. Now, the contract through Endeavors, which is a Texas-based non-profit, is for 6 months, but it could be extended and also expanded. Now, the hotels will be near the border areas, including Arizona and Texas. And ICE oversees the custody of migrant adults and families who cross the border illegally after they are apprehended by Border Patrol agents. And the agency is said to be already transforming its family detention facilities into rapid processing centres with the goal of releasing families within 72 hours. Makes a change from 2 weeks, I suppose. Now, regardless, the contracts with hotels point to the agency not being able to keep up with the growing number of families in its custody. So what is the bigger picture here? Well, immigration agencies have used hotels in the past, as recently as last year, for unaccompanied minors who the Trump administration was quickly expelling under an emergency public health order. Now, the hotel rooms are said to be a safer option than Border Patrol stations, but do not have to follow the same safety protocols that official government detention spaces do. Read between the lines with that. Now, the number of migrant family members caught crossing the southwest border more than doubled between January and February, rising from 7,000 to nearly 19,000, according to the most recently released agency data. So, as soon as the masked man got in, the increase in migrants developed as well. And no, that is not a coincidence either. We warned about it in shows last year. Now, border officials continue to use a Trump-era order to quickly return many families to Mexico. But Mexico has limited capacity to take migrant families and won't accept some with young children, according to administration officials. Now, 42% of families were expelled to Mexico last month, which is down from 64% in January and 91% in October, which was when Trump was in place. And the report said more than 13,000 family members who crossed the US border illegally have been allowed into the country since the start of January, and many released into the border communities. Reservations by any chance? Just saying. And the Biden administration does not use the order to expel unaccompanied children as the previous administration did. So what do we need to watch out for here? Well, the Biden administration has been pressing the Mexican government to increase its own immigration enforcement to help slow the number of Central Americans arriving their way through the country to the US-Mexico border. And there you have it. And I hate to say this, but it is borne in facts. These arrivals are little to do with people wishing to move to America, but more of a front for illegal practices of which many lead Democrats are involved in. That's why the changes. And these migrants are gang-related, child trafficking, sex slavery children, and adrenochrome victims. All for your fake celebrities out of Hollywood and surrounding areas. Now, no one is saying we don't wish to help migrants. But here's the kicker. If $86 million can be found to fund people who are not from America, why hasn't that amount found or more be found to fix the mass homeless situation happening in this country to its own people? Another common sense question. $150 billion is how much of Iraq's oil money has been stolen and smuggled out of the country in corrupt deals. Courtesy of the CIA, Obama, Bush, Netanyahu, and Khomeini are responsible for that. And all this has happened since the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. And this is the overall estimate done by the Iraqi President Barham Salih. Now, the statement came as the Iraqi President submitted a draft Corrupt Funds Recovery Act to the Iraqi Parliament. And the draft law seeks to strengthen the powers of the Iraqi nation in order to recover money stolen in corrupt deals, to hold corrupt people accountable and also bring them to justice. And he urged Iraqi lawmakers to discuss and approve the proposed legislation to help curb this dangerous scourge that has deprived our people of enjoying the wealth of their country for many years. And Salih, the Prime Minister, said, the stolen money would be enough to significantly improve Iraqi finances. Indeed. And according to Salih, the legislation would seek to recover the misappropriated funds through the cooperation of other governments, good luck with that, and in partnership with international bodies, good luck with that also, as they will wheel out the cover-up act called National Security. And he said, here I reiterate Iraq's call, which we have previously issued at the United Nations General Assembly, for the formation of an international coalition to fight corruption along the lines of International Coalition Against ISIS. And he said the challenge of corruption is no less dangerous than terrorism. Why? Because the corruption and terrorists are one and the same group is why, and they have 3 letters. Here is a piece on a country we have not yet covered in any great details. And it's another country created by the Bolsheviks with the split up of Russia, and this is Belarus. Now, Belarus has been plagued by political turmoil over what they describe Belarus as Europe's last dictatorship. Really. And why is he called a dictator? Because that president of Belarus is in denial of COVID-19. And Belarus has ended up with one of the lowest death rates on the continent, according to the report. And their beleaguered government remains unfazed by COVID-19. And the president, Alexander Lukashenko, who's been in power since 1994, has flatly denied the seriousness of the pandemic, refusing to impose a lockdown. He refused to close schools or cancel mass events like the Belarusian Football League, which is soccer, or the Victory Day Parade, which apparently makes him a despot or a psychopathic dictator, according to the clowns. And yet the country's death rate is amongst the lowest in Europe, just over 700 in a population of 9.5 million, with over 73,000 confirmed cases. Oops, I guess he was right, and the so-called experts were wrong. So there is this pandemic mindset, and the relatively low death rate is thought to be thanks to Belarus's large hospital capacity, which allowed the country to isolate people early on, according to Andrei Vitushka, who is a healthcare policy expert at the Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies. And he said with 11 hospital beds per 1,000 people, Belarus outnumbers other nations like Germany, who only have 8 beds per 1,000 people, or the UK, even worse, 2.5 beds per 1,000 people. And that makes you a dictator. And Vitushka said it's usually a problem because it takes a lot of money to maintain them, but it turned into our advantage in this situation. So, according to the clowns, the hospital beds saved Belarus. The magic of COVID strikes again. Because once it finds a bed in an awakened country, it magically cures itself. Amazing stuff. Now, Belarus, like most of the post-Soviet states, has a focus on sanitary problems, meaning large-scale health scares like a pandemic, according to Rasmus Nielsen, who's a teaching fellow at the University College London School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies. And he said this may be one of the reasons Belarus has outperformed most of Europe in terms of mass testing during the first 4 months of the pandemic, while many countries were reluctant to carry out extensive testing, according to the state-owned news agency Beltar. Testing in Belarus started as early as January the 23rd. But unfortunately for them, most kits were donated or purchased from China and also Russia, using government funds and donations from companies and ordinary citizens. And the country stepped up its testing in early April, developing its own rapid testing kits and switching to the use of domestically produced reagents for the polymerase chain reaction testing in May. Maybe that's why less of them died. They used their own testing kits. Now, according to the government information there are now 32 laboratories processing samples across the country, and testing is widespread in hospitals as well as from GPs, general practitioners. And by the end of June, Belarus had conducted more than 1 million tests, which is about 10% of its population. But with the low expectations of the authorities, Belarusians were bracing themselves for the worst, with the last of a handful of press briefings on the pandemic, which was held on the 24th of April last year. And information on safety protocols and a country's situation has been scarce, inconsistent, and often contradictory. So the people looked after themselves, and they have the lowest death rate in Europe. And Vatushka said it's a personal decision for every citizen. If you want, you wear a mask. If you don't want to, you don't wear a mask, and this is not a problem. No, it's not. People practicing personal responsibility has often proven better than authoritarian rule. So the citizens of Belarus began practicing self-isolation early on, and on March the 26th, 2020, a crowdfunding campaign by COVID-19 was launched in order to buy safety equipment for hospitals across the country, and the movement collected around $360,000 in 3 months, and with the help of nearly 1,500 volunteers, they purchased and distributed around 450,000 pieces of personal protective equipment, oxygen tanks, hello India, and also other medical equipment. Now, although it was initially slow to react, the health ministry has worked alongside and by COVID-19 and taken measures to reorganize hospitals and encourage social distancing, says Vatushka. Now, another factor is that Belarus has very few care homes, 203 beds per 100,000 of the population, compared with 854 in the UK, with most elderly citizens living separately. Now, this has helped shield, they say, its most vulnerable, and in many cases in Belarus, you have already had some isolation of the elderly people, particularly in the countryside or in single flats. Now, Nielsen says Belarus has also benefited from a relatively isolated country, where the government can easily shut down borders and monitor those passing through. And he said people tend to go in the other direction. He says very few people will go to Belarus for holidays or work. Now, what the report says, they're not yet out of the woods, with anti-government demonstrations going on in Minsk and other big cities following a controversial August 9th election that awarded Lukashenko another term. Belarus, they say, will likely see a sudden spike in infections, except they didn't. And Nielsen believes this will serve as another pretext to crack down on government critics. Interesting comment. Now, Lukashenko has allegedly overcome coronavirus infection. It's funny how all the leaders got it, didn't they? Boris Johnson, Trump, Lukashenko. Which is, in math terms, quite an alarming high percentage, is it not? Does it make sense? No, it's a program then, isn't it? And Nielsen says, framing it as yet another chapter in Belarus's historical sufferings that the country managed to overcome. And he said, this is Lukashenko 101, and he's probably not going to change. And he said, although the low death numbers are encouraging, some experts fear, there we go again, that many coronavirus-related deaths are registered as cases of pneumonia, which is actually correct. or flu. And the UN data shows a difference of 5,605 people between April and June 2019 compared with the same period in 2020, and the deaths per capita ratio remains one of the highest in Europe. No, the report said it's the lowest. They love their pro-pagan dad, don't they? Now, Nielsen is cautious until we have the figures for excess deaths. I don't want to praise Belarus too much. You don't want to praise them too much because what they were doing was correct. They denied the pandemic, they didn't have lockdowns, they didn't close the schools, and hardly anybody died. Fact. And just because Mr. Nielsen works for the clowns and doesn't want to praise Belarus too much, we will. Because clearly their policy of not buying into the COVID scam has worked for that country. With less deaths, infections and issues to deal with, Belarus have kept going whilst taking the modicum of precautions that was required, unlike the so-called larger countries. The big EU countries have been raped and lost many jobs and businesses, and thankfully Belarus continued a more normal living and hopefully can kick on in the former Rus country.